Well, what about presentations in the media? And here it becomes, I think, more blatant, at least in some cases. Now, it's not all the same. But there's this famous statement from Carl Sagan. He gave this television series. It was a wonderful series in many respects. But he says, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Well, that's an explicitly materialistic, or at least atheistic statement. What does that have to do with the science that Sagan is trying to champion? It really doesn't. It's a mixture, you see, of materialist philosophy, his own personal view, which we've got to respect. He's a fellow human being, right? If you're a Christian, you want to say, this is a fellow human being. We've got to respect the fact of what views he has, even if we disagree with them. But that's different from the science. Or the nature shows, or talk about Mother Nature, and you almost get to places, you know, here's these beautiful baby foxes, right, or the otters playing, and it's just wonderful, some of these programs. It's so wonderful, in fact, that it's almost irresistible as human beings to want to give thanks. You have to have somebody or something to praise. So Mother Nature becomes the substitute for personal God. And we say Mother Nature, it's sort of semi-personified, but really you're dealing with matter and motion and energy. So pure materialism, as I've laid it out, is impersonalist at root. Everything is built on the matter and energy and motion with no innate purpose. But everybody knows that there's complexity built on top of that. And that complexity is further analyzed, and the scientists have given us a great deal of information of analyzing a lot of that complexity, right? So you have atoms, and you can go inside the atoms too, but let's not. So you've got molecules made out of atoms, you've got organelles, you've got tiny little things within individual cells that have an internal structure to them. You've got whole cells. You've got organs that are clusters of cells with interlocking tissues and functions. You've got whole organisms. And those organisms include human beings who then have purposes. So suddenly, even though there is no innate purpose in the universe as a whole, purposes arise at a human level. Now, it's kind of a mystery how conscious purposes arise. But look what happens, right? We have purposes. We want significance. We have desires to love and to be loved. We want to live forever. We have spiritual hunger. Now, I believe that God has placed that in us. But what if you're a materialist? What do you do with all that? The universe is a very frustrating place for a materialist. And I think we've got to have compassion on people who are there, because it's as if they're living in a spiritual desert, right? They have as persons, desires that can never be fulfilled. But it also shows the significance of the debate, doesn't it, right? You better figure this out. Because if you don't get it right, your losses could be supreme. Well, let's talk a little bit about the alleged conflicts between science and Bible and science and faith and so on. I think you already can see that I think at root, most of the conflict is between philosophical materialism and the Bible. It is a philosophical position rather than science at its best that is doing a lot of, creating a lot of the conflict. And I want to show you that in several different areas. Now, we can only do that briefly. But I think these areas, I hope they'll be suggestive for what might be worked out much more thoroughly. let's take the issue of miracles. Do miracles happen? Okay? And I'm going to analyze this in terms of the two competing worldviews. So on the left-hand side, I've got what I've labeled impersonalism, but it's this materialistic worldview, right? You've got your matter, energy, and motion. And on the right-hand side, I've called personalism. I think, really, I don't want to get into it, but I think biblical Christianity is thoroughly personalistic, and even the other theistic religions are not. Because it's tri-personalistic. There's personality and personal relationships even within God before the world was created. So this is deep personalism. What's the difference in how they would approach the issue of miracle, right? Well, if it's impersonalistic universe with a mechanistic view of law, then there can be no exceptions. There are no miracles. The evidence, if somebody appeals to evidence, is never sufficient, and so on. If you believe that the world is created by a personal God who cares for humanity, who has personal purposes, then there can be exceptions to his regular way of governing the universe, because he's governing it personally. It's not an impersonal mechanism. And the miracles are just exceptional instances where, out of his compassion for human beings, he does something out of the ordinary. Here's an instance, Exodus 7:17. Thus says the Lord, by this you will know that I am the Lord. Here's a personal claim. You will know, I will show you who I am as God. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. And the materialist is saying this cannot happen. Why not? Because there is no God. There's just matter and motion. There's just mechanistic law. There are no exceptions. God says, I do what I want. And I'm going to make an exception. Now, I know there's discussion. Was this some kind of red plankton and so on came down the Nile? Well, God can use means if he wants. But he's not constrained by the means either. So I believe that this is one instance out of many that fits robustly and easily into a biblical view of the world, but is totally out of sync and seems very implausible, if not impossible, when you read it out of a materialistic worldview. So it's going to affect how people read the Bible. And some of you, I know you're believers in the Bible and you're communicating with people who aren't. One of the issues is, how is this other person reading the Bible, right? If he's going to read it at all, is he going to read it assuming, I already know what kind of world I'm in. I already know it's all about matter and motion. Okay, here's a second issue. The allegation that the Bible is primitive in taking the earth to be the center of the universe. And the people who accuse the Bible of primitivity will even cite verses. Psalm 93, verse 1, the world is established, it shall never be moved. They'll say, well, isn't that assuming the earth is at the center of things? And the sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises, Ecclesiastes 1:5. And but what happens to these verses depends on worldview. All right, so let's do our worldview thing again. And on the left, we've got, as usual, our matter and energy and motion. And I believe often the assumption that modern science has really given us the reality, the deep structure of the world. This is what is really there as opposed to what primitive people have thought is there. And human beings, they have a role, but their very existence is accidental. In the personal world created by God, he cares for us. Personal perspectives are real. Not only God's perspective as a person, which is ultimate, right? But you as a person and your perspective is part of the reality that God sustains. What you experience is not unreal. It's not on the same level as science, but it's perfectly real. God intended it that way. And when he speaks, as he does in the Bible, he speaks to where we are. So here's the same verse, Ecclesiastes 1:5, and a young woman say, I do see the sunrise from my vantage points, what the theologians have called phenomenal language. But I think it's more than just a language of appearance. It's a language of reality. It really is this way from the standpoint of the observer. And God cares about that observer standpoint, not just about some allegedly ultimate scientific analysis. And so it makes sense. But it makes sense depending on your worldview. All right, here's another one. Days of creation. Now, you know, this can be very controversial, okay? And we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I want you to see that even here, there's this worldview kind of influence that comes in. Here's the two worldviews, right? Here's impersonalism, impersonal law, right? Law that is the same through all time because it's mechanistic, versus a personalism where God speaks the law. God brings the whole universe into existence. And the days of creation are a distinct time. They're the time when God was engaged in creating the fundamental structures that are now in place. If so, the 6 days mentioned in Genesis 1 lead to a mature creation at the end. And that means in some respects, now what respects could be debated, but in some respects, those 6 days are unique in the whole history of the world. They're unlike anything else. And of course, Genesis makes a point that they're very different because God is bringing into existence those fundamental structures that we now enjoy. What we now have, the theologians call providence, meaning God governs the world, but it's a world that's already, he's finished creating. Okay? Now, that means there's a fundamental discontinuity, and it's the boundary right there. Yes? Between the 6 days of original work of creation and what comes afterwards. One of the possibilities, now this is not the only possibility, but it's one of the possibilities that I think ought to be treated much more seriously than many people treat it, is that those 6 days lead to a mature creation and that therefore it may have the appearance of age. Now think about it. If Adam and Eve were created mature, was the whole universe, by the end of the 6 days, created in a mature state? Because the way God was operating during the 6 days was different, maybe very different from what we now see in terms of the regularities of his providence. Current scientific law is all about God's providence, not directly about those 6 days of creation. So I believe that what's involved here is a difference between somebody who thinks he sees the law as just a mechanism always in place versus the work of a person. Now here's another way, another alternative there are a number of alternatives that people have attempted to work with in seeing the harmony between biblical teaching and scientific evidence. And here's another one. If we have science as ultimate in an impersonalistic world, then what really matters, and again it's sort of bottom level, is clock time as scientifically measured. And days then are defined by scientific precise measurements, atomic clocks, vibrations of cesium atoms, whatever is the current technology. Now, if you're in a personalistic world, persons matter. God, of course, matters preeminently, right? And God created the world in a pattern of work and rest. I believe there's rest between the 6 days. That's the way it's depicted. And that humans are created in God's image, so there is human social time of a rhythm of work and rest at night, but rest also for special social occasions. And we work 6 days, and then there's a final rest that our small rest times look forward to. The final rest from creation for God. God works 6 days and then rests from creation at the end of it, and we imitate that pattern. That means that the timing of all this is a timing interacting with the personal character of God and us as persons. Are the days then to be seen primarily as days of personal work and rest? And scientific measurements are secondary. Particularly, I think I want to raise the question in this view of things called the analogical day view, observes that when God rested from creation, the rest was presumably permanent. He didn't start creating again at the end of 24 hours. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. He continued to rule the world in providence, but he was through with creation. That rest, I believe, goes on. God is still resting to this day, and his rest then is everlasting. That seventh day, I believe, is everlasting. It's not 24 hours. Now, others will disagree, and I think, the way to deal with it is get in and weigh the different views. My point is less to say this is the definitive answer or something like that, than to say it looks very different when you take seriously the fact that this world is created by a personal God, and that his concern for persons is at the heart of things. It's not something peripheral. It's not something that ought to be shoved aside as not the real thing by some modern conception of science. Science can fit into, a good kind of science can fit into that conception. And of course, when the people like Copernicus and Newton were working on it, they were working in a view where they saw themselves as thinking God's thoughts after him, as exploring a universe that God governed. So there's the days of creation. Now, how are we doing on time? I want to spend a minute or two talking about the way we view history, because the same kind of conflict is going to come through there. And in a sense, what I hope to do is to prepare you to see this conflict is operative all the way across the field in the disputes in modern life between different people. What is the nature of history? How do we understand it? If you live in an impersonal world, then events are fundamentally things that just happen. They're impersonal. They don't have any innate meaning. And those events will be fundamentally the same through time. Again, it's a mechanism of law. Numerical in particular, right? If you live in a personal world governed by God, God has purpose for history, then there are going to be decisive moments in which God is going to act in special ways to push forward the accomplishment of his purpose. The Exodus from Egypt, we already dealt with one plague, right? It's the plague of the waters turned to blood. There were 10 plagues, and at the end of those 10 plagues, the people of Israel came out of Egypt. Why? Because God loved them, because God chose them, because God had committed himself personally in a promise made to Abraham, their ancestor, centuries before. That's all highly personalistic. It also makes perfect sense if God is the personal ruler. It makes no sense if the world is just a mechanism. The resurrection of Christ, many of you know, that is central, absolutely central to the Christian faith as a whole. But the impersonalists will say, resurrections don't happen. Well, were the people of the first century naive? Did they think resurrections were popping out all over the place? No. They were just as astonished as we are to hear the story. The disciples weren't expecting Jesus' resurrection, even though he told them about it. They expected, if they were good Jews, they expected a resurrection of the dead at the end of time, but not in the middle. So this is an extraordinary event, but it makes sense in terms of a personal God who sent his own Son into the world to die for people's sins, to be raised to new life in order to deliver them from their rebellion and from the guilt of their sin, and to be reconciled to them. The resurrection fits into God's plan. It's not irrational. It's not an exception to God's plan. It is an exception if you think that the world is governed impersonally. Very different, right? Is morality, particularly if we think about Christian morality, is morality a straitjacket? There are a lot of people who think it is, right? And there's a lot of indignation about Christians who people see we're trying to impose our moral standards on everybody. And actually, the real objection is to God, who's the ultimate imposer. And, you know, when Christians are saying these things, hopefully we can do it graciously. But we haven't got any choice. We didn't invent this thing, right? It's God who's saying, this is the kind of God I am. From a materialist point of view, it's all about freedom to make our own standards because there's no innate meaning, right? And so you get individualism often and autonomy. I'll make my own laws. No innate purpose, right? So human beings have to, in effect, create purpose. And so moral standards tend to be relativized by that. I think the best of these people morally still hope that we can get along with one another and that our more loving desires will be the ones we choose. But the fact is that we're creating significance. Whereas in a biblical view of the world, God designed us and he directs us. When he gives us moral standards, it's for our good. It's not just to be mean. But it's to bless us. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Makes perfect sense if God, who created the whole universe and who is infinitely wise, is directing you. What better kind of direction could you have? Makes no sense if you want to be your own God. One religion. Here's another issue. Right? Is there one true religion? Don, I'm just inventing a fictional character here, but he's close to people you'll meet on the street. He says all religions are wrong, and their competing claims cancel each other out. But if he says that, he implies that he knows an awful lot about God and about the spiritual world. Right? How can you seriously reject all religions without really thoroughly exploring them? And I think what's happening very often is the background of this kind of thing is a kind of sociological or maybe even more atmospheric influence of modern culture, right? This tide that I've described in materialism. Don's idea is that culture, particularly the culture of your parents, you have the religion of your parents, right? Culture is generating religion. And culture also, unfortunately for Don, generates the sociology of religion and Don's own views. It tends to swallow up everything. But in a Christian view, God generates the cultures. He doesn't approve of everything in them, but he's sovereign over them, and he reveals himself within them. And therefore, there is true and false religion, right? The true religion is the one that worships the true God according to the way that he specifies, and false is any alternative. Those two views are radically antithetical to one another, but they tend to be generated by the underlying assumptions of either personalism or impersonalism. What kind of world do we live in, right? And the trouble that I find in talking to people about this kind of thing is they're often unaware that they're living in a sea that's dragging them in this materialistic and impersonalistic direction. They've got all kinds of baggage that they're assuming the nature of the world without recognizing it, right? And so a Christian position sounds arrogant or it sounds like it's unwarranted in its exclusive claims. But underneath all those things are assumptions, right? And those assumptions don't really have a good foundation. So in a biblical view of things, it's opposed, of course, to the cultural relativism you get with somebody like Don, but it's opposed to the kind of feelings that he has. What would be nice if we could just all get along and we didn't have to fight about such things? Behind all that being a modern worldview and assumptions about what kind of world we live in. Here's one final area, and I'll have to close off with this. The alleged limits of language. People say human language is really inadequate to talk about God, so we really don't know, any of us, what we're talking about. That often is generated, again, against a background of an ultimate impersonalism. And in that impersonalism, you're just a captive of your social world. There is no God. Religion is really just one sample out of a language which exists in a social world from which there is no exit, right? So ultimately, you've got an impersonalist environment. And in that, it does make sense to say language can't really talk adequately about God. But if you're in a personalistic world where God really exists, then it's quite different. Well, again, in the impersonalistic world, I switched the slide here. The Bible itself is viewed as a social product for anthropological study. It's just one among many religious products, and all those products, by assumption, because they can't be anything else, by assumption, all those products are merely human products, right? They're in the closed room that we can never get out of. But in a biblical worldview, God, of course, is in charge. He can speak. And the Bible is his voice. So it's a very different view of the Bible that you get, depending on which of these views you occupy. John 17:17, sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. I mention this verse partly because I think the character of what God made us is we were not meant to live in a vacuum without God's instruction. We were meant to hear his voice, even before human beings rebelled against him. We were meant to hear his voice. We were meant to live in communion with him. And people fall into all kinds of confusions if they will not be instructed by God's voice. So where do you go from here? You have this choice of conflicting views, right? Materialism and biblical personalism. If you're an unbeliever, I would encourage you to lay aside modern prejudices and meet Jesus. Because you've absorbed a lot. We've all absorbed a lot from the surrounding society. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. But one of the things that you and I are hitting is this tide of materialism. Lay that aside and meet Jesus, who says, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And how do you meet Jesus? Well, read the Bible and ask God to show who he is. And be prepared to meet some uncomfortable facts about yourself as well. Because we're sinners in rebellion against God. One of the reasons why people don't come to Christ is because they don't want to face their own failures. If you're a believer in Christ already, then I believe that these issues are asking for a continual renewal. I cite Psalm 119, 105. Your word, that is, the word of God, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. We really do need instruction from God on a continual basis if we're going to follow him and not be seduced by competing ideas and worldviews. Thank you.